The wind across the high plains of Wyoming spoke a language of its own, a desolate dialect of grit and forgotten promises. It was a sound Silas Blackwood had paid his entire life to hear. Every dollar earned, every callous groan, every lonely night spent dreaming of silence had been traded for this expanse of unforgiving land and the simple, unadorned cabin that squatted upon it. He had purchased his solitude, paid in full, and now he stood on the porch, a man whittled down to his essentials, watching the sun bleed out across the horizon. This was to be his sanctuary, the final chapter in a book he wished no one else to read. The air was thin and cold, sharp in his lungs, and for the first time in 30 years, it felt clean. He had left the world of men behind, with its noise, its greed, its casual cruelties. Here, the only cruelty was that of nature, an honest and impartial force he could understand and respect. He walked the property line as dusk settled, not out of concern for trespassers, for who would come here, but as a ritual of possession. This rock, this patch of stubborn sage, this skeletal tree clawing at the sky, they were all his. It was near the property's edge, where a cluster of ancient, wind-stunted cottonwoods formed a dark knot against the bruised twilight, that he found it. At first, it was just a shape, a pale disruption in the deepening shadows. His mind, conditioned by years on cattle drives, registered it as a stray calf, perhaps, or a deer caught in a snare. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved itself with sickening clarity. It was a person, a woman. She was suspended from the thickest branch of the largest tree, not by a rope around her neck, but by leather cords cruelly fastened to hooks pierced through the flesh of her breasts. Her body hung limp, a pale pendulum in the dying light, her head lolled to one side, a cascade of filthy, matted hair obscuring her face. Her simple homespun dress was torn and stained, and her bare feet, blue with cold, dangled inches from the frozen earth. Silas froze, the clean air turning to ash in his throat. This was the world he had paid to escape, but it had followed him. It had found his sanctuary and desecrated it with a horror more profound than he could have imagined. Despair, cold and sharp, pierced the fragile peace he had just begun to build. This was not the honest cruelty of the wild. This was the deliberate, meticulous sadism of mankind. For a long moment, he was paralyzed by a mixture of revulsion and a deep, world-weary sorrow. He had wanted to be alone, but not like this. Never like this. He saw the unnatural tension in the skin, the dark, dried blood that tracked down her torso. He heard the wind move through the branches, a low moan that seemed to emanate from the broken figure itself. He could turn around, walk back to his cabin, and pretend he had seen nothing. He could let the wilderness claim her, erasing this stain from his land. It would be the easy thing to do, the preservation of the solitude he had sacrificed everything for. But as a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through her suspended form, he knew he could not. Some small, defiant flicker of life still clung to that brutalized body. The stakes were no longer about his peace. They were about the last ember of humanity shivering in the encroaching dark. He approached the tree, his movements slow and deliberate, the way one approaches a terrified, wounded animal. The air grew thick with the metallic scent of blood and the faint, sour smell of suffering. He could see the rise and fall of her chest, a movement so shallow it was almost invisible. She was alive. That single, terrible fact changed everything. He reached into his coat for his knife, the worn handle familiar and steadying in his trembling hand. He looked up at the branch, at the cruel leather and the unyielding hooks, and then at the still, pale form hanging beneath it. The work ahead would be agonizing, for both of them. He had bought this land to be his grave, a quiet place to let the world forget him. Instead, it had become a crucible, and as he prepared to cut her down, Silas Blackwood understood that his solitude was over. He had found not peace, but a war he had not known he was meant to fight, and its first casualty was hanging right before his eyes. The wind howled, and the long, cold night began to fall. The task of freeing her was a gruesome piece of surgery performed in near darkness. With the blade of his knife, Silas had to saw through the thick leather cords, his hands working just inches from the ghastly wounds. Each movement of the branch, jostled by his efforts, sent a tremor through her body and elicited a low, guttural sound from her throat. Not a cry of pain, but the unconscious exhalation of a creature pushed beyond endurance. He worked with a grim, focused intensity, his jaw tight, sweat beading on his brow despite the biting cold. The world narrowed to the glint of steel, the creak of leather, and the horrifying fragility of the woman in his hands. He supported her weight with one arm, a dead, cold burden that felt heavier than any calf he'd ever hauled from a ditch. When the final cord gave way, she collapsed against him, a heap of bone and ragged breath, her unconsciousness a small mercy. He gathered her into his arms, surprised by her lightness, and began the slow walk back to the cabin, his sanctuary now her infirmary. The home he had built to be an escape from the world's suffering was about to become its epicenter. Inside, he laid her on his own cot, the only soft surface in the Spartan room. The fire in the hearth was low, casting long, dancing shadows that made the cabin feel both cavernous and claustrophobic. By the flickering light, he could finally see the full extent of the damage. The wounds on her chest were deep and infected, the skin around them swollen and discolored. Her body was a roadmap of cruelty, a canvas of bruises, cuts, and abrasions. She was emaciated, her cheekbones sharp points beneath a layer of grime, her lips cracked and blue. He worked silently, methodically. He stoked the fire, heated water, and tore strips from one of his few clean shirts to serve as bandages. He cleaned her wounds as gently as he could, his large, rough hands moving with an unpracticed tenderness. She flinched and moaned in her stupor, her limbs occasionally twitching with the memory of pain, but she did not wake. He covered her with his thickest wool blanket, tucking it around her frail form, and then retreated to a wooden stool in the corner of the room. He sat there for the rest of the night, watching, listening to the shallow rasp of her breathing, a sentinel at the gates of a life he had unwittingly taken into his charge. His solitude had been shattered, replaced by a profound and heavy sense of responsibility. She woke 3 days later. The fever had broken the night before, the violent shivering giving way to a damp, exhausted stillness. Silas was mending a piece of tack by the fire when he heard a sharp intake of breath. He looked over. Her eyes were open, wide and dark in her pale face. They were not the eyes of a person, but of a cornered animal. They darted around the small cabin, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the single window, the fire, and finally, him. The moment her gaze landed on him, a raw, primal terror seized her. She scrambled backward on the cot, a choked, rasping sound tearing from her throat as the movement pulled at her injuries. She pressed herself against the cold log wall, her hands coming up to shield her face, her body coiled like a spring, ready to bolt or fight. There was no recognition, no pleading, only a stark, instinctual fear of him, of his size, of his gender, of the simple fact that he was there. Silas immediately set down his work and raised his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace he'd used 1,000 times on spooked horses. He didn't speak. Words would be a violence to the fragile silence she had awakened into. He stayed on his stool across the room, creating a distance she could perceive as safe. He moved with a deliberate slowness, every motion telegraphed, non-threatening. He saw the flicker of confusion in her eyes as she registered her surroundings. She was not in the tree. She was warm. She was bandaged. But this understanding did nothing to quell the terror. He was still a man, and men were the architects of her pain. He was the unknown, the potential for more suffering. For an hour they remained like that, a tableau of fear and patience. Eventually, he rose slowly and ladled some broth from a pot warming by the hearth into a wooden bowl. He placed it on the floor, halfway between them, before retreating back to his corner. It was a silent offering, a statement of intent. I will not harm you. I will give you sustenance. She watched the bowl, her eyes flicking from it to him, a war of instinct raging within her. The need to survive fought against the terror that told her it was a trap. The steam rose from the bowl, carrying the scent of salt and herbs, a scent of life in a room that still smelled of sickness and despair. Days bled into a silent routine, a carefully choreographed dance of distance and necessity. Silas would wake before dawn, tend to the fire, and leave a bowl of broth or watered-down oatmeal on the floor for her before heading outside to do his chores. He split wood, repaired the crumbling corral, and hunted for small game. His activities a steady, rhythmic backdrop to the quiet terror unfolding inside the cabin. He never tried to approach her. He never spoke. He made himself a predictable, non-threatening part of the landscape. From inside, she watched him. Through the single smudged pane of the window, she saw a man who moved with purpose, who was as much a part of this harsh, unforgiving land as the rocks and the wind. He was big, yes, and the sight of his broad back and powerful hands still sent a tremor of fear through her. But his presence was constant, not predatory. He was like the mountain on the horizon, immense, silent, and simply there. She remained on the cot, a small, wounded creature in her den. The physical pain was a roaring fire that slowly banked to smoldering embers. But the pain in her mind was a shard of ice that did not melt. Memories came in flashes, disjointed and brutal. Shouting faces contorted with righteousness, the searing pain as the hooks went in, the jeers of the crowd, the feeling of her own weight tearing at her flesh. She would wake from these waking nightmares with a silent scream locked in her throat, her body drenched in a cold sweat. In those moments, the sight of Silas outside, chopping wood with a steady, metronomic rhythm, was strangely calming. He was not one of them. He was not part of that screaming mob. He was a force of quiet labor, a man who seemed to have no words, only actions. One morning, he left a small bowl of water and a clean rag next to her food. It was a simple gesture, but it was an acknowledgement of her dignity, an invitation to reclaim a small piece of herself. After he had been gone for an hour, she cautiously crept from the cot, every muscle screaming in protest, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she washed her own face. The cool water was a shock, a baptism. As she looked at her distorted reflection in the water bowl, she saw not just the ghost of a girl who had been destroyed, but the faintest glimmer of someone who had, against all odds, survived. The first snow came early, a thick, wet blanket that smothered the world in silence and white. It confined them to the cabin, shrinking their world to the 4 log walls and the glowing hearth. The careful distance Silas had maintained became impossible. The space was too small, the silence too loud. He slept on the floor near the door, a gesture she understood was for her peace of mind, not his comfort. He gave her the cot, the fire's warmth, the better part of their dwindling food stores. His sacrifice was as silent and constant as his breathing in the night. He never asked for thanks. He never asked for anything. Alara. She remembered her name in a dream, a whisper from a life before the tree, began to mend. The wounds on her chest were beginning to scar over, tight and angry, but the skin was closing. She could move now with less pain, and with the movement came a slow, creeping return to the world. She started to help in small ways. She would feed kindling into the fire when it burned low. She would use the clean rags to wipe down the single wooden table. Each action was a reclamation, a small rebellion against the helplessness that had consumed her. One evening, a blizzard descended, a shrieking fury of wind and snow that shook the cabin to its foundations. The wind howled like a pack of wolves, and the cold seeped through the chinks in the logs. Silas worked for an hour to secure the door and board up the window against the storm's assault. When he was finished, he came to sit by the fire, his face etched with weariness. The flickering light cast deep shadows across his rugged features, making him look older, more tired than she had ever seen him. He was staring into the flames, lost in a place she couldn't see, when a log shifted, sending a shower of sparks onto the hearth. He didn't seem to notice. Without thinking, Alara reached out with the iron poker and nudged the log back into place. He turned his head, his gaze meeting hers across the small space. For the first time, she didn't flinch. She saw no threat in his eyes, only a deep, abiding sadness that seemed to mirror her own. The silence stretched, filled only by the roar of the storm outside. Then she spoke. Her voice was a dry, rasping thing, and used and broken. "Cold," she whispered. It was just one word, a simple observation, but it felt like a monumental effort, a bridge built across a chasm of terror and pain. Silas's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, surprise, relief, passed through his eyes. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He said, his own voice gravelly. The storm raged on, but inside the small, warm cabin, the ice had finally begun to break. Winter tightened its grip, isolating the homestead completely. The world beyond their small clearing ceased to exist, buried under a deep and unforgiving layer of snow. Survival became a stark, daily calculus of firewood, dried meat, and shared warmth. The forced proximity eroded the boundaries of fear and unfamiliarity, replacing them with a quiet, functional rhythm. Alara grew stronger. The haunted, feral look in her eyes was slowly replaced by a watchful intelligence. She took on more tasks, her movements becoming more fluid, less pained. She learned to patch Silas's worn clothing with a surprising neatness, to knead the dense, heavy dough for their daily bread, to read the mood of the fire and know exactly when it needed another log. These small domestic acts were an anchor, grounding her in the present and pushing away the tidal wave of her past. Silas accepted her help with the same quiet stoicism with which he had accepted her presence. There were no words of thanks, only a shared understanding that passed between them in the handing of a tool or a nod of acknowledgement across the room. They were two solitary creatures learning to share a territory. She learned the landscape of his silence. She could tell by the set of his shoulders if the hunting had been poor, by the way he cleaned his rifle if his thoughts were troubled. He, in turn, learned to read the subtle shifts in her demeanor. He knew the days when the memories were close, when a sudden noise would make her jump or a shadow in the corner would hold her gaze for too long. On those days, he would make himself scarce, giving her the space she needed, or he would engage in a loud, repetitive task like sharpening an axe, the rhythmic sound a steadying presence against the chaos in her mind. They were mapping each other's sorrows without ever speaking of them. One afternoon, while mending one of his shirts, she found a small, skillfully carved wooden bird tucked away in a pocket. It was smooth and simple, its form captured in a few elegant lines. She looked over at Silas, who was oiling a trap by the fire. He didn't seem to notice her discovery. She held the small object in her palm, its smoothness a stark contrast to the rough scars on her chest. It was a thing of quiet beauty, a testament to a gentle skill that seemed at odds with the harsh, capable man who possessed it. She tucked it back into the pocket, a secret she now shared with him, a piece of his hidden self that he had unknowingly revealed. The story of what had happened to her came out not in a torrent, but in fragments, like shards of broken glass working their way to the surface. It began one night when the wind was particularly violent, its mournful cry too much like the sound of a crowd. She was sitting by the fire, her hands clenched in her lap, her knuckles white. Silas was on the other side of the hearth, carving another piece of wood. "They called it a cleansing," she said, her voice barely a whisper, directed at the flames. Silas's hands stilled, but he did not look at her. He kept his gaze on his work, giving her the freedom to speak without the pressure of being watched. "We were different, my family. We didn't follow their preacher. We kept to the old ways, the ones from across the sea." She paused, her breath hitching. "Jedediah, the man who owned the valley, he said we were a blight, a sickness. He used the preacher's words to turn everyone against us." The knife in Silas's hand was motionless. "They came at night, burned our farm. My father, my brother. They fought back." Her voice broke. "Jedediah said an example had to be made, for the good of the community. He said a woman's pride was a vessel for sin, and it had to be emptied." She touched her chest, her fingers tracing the scarred tissue beneath her dress. "He made the whole town watch." Silas set his carving and his knife down on the floor beside him, The soft click of wood on was the only sound. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He didn't say it was all right because it wasn't. He simply sat there, a silent witness to her testimony, his presence a solid, unshakable anchor in the storm of her memory. His silence was not empty. It was filled with a shared outrage, a deep and profound condemnation of the cruelty she described. In that moment, she knew she was safe, not just from the elements but from judgment. He had heard the worst of it, and he had not turned away. The first sign of the thaw came not from the weather, but from the west. A smudge of smoke on the horizon, too deliberate for a wildfire. Silas saw it first. He was on the small ridge behind the cabin, checking his snares, when his eyes caught the unnatural plume against the pale blue sky. He watched it for a long time, his body rigid. It was a traveler's fire, maybe two, which meant riders. And they were coming from the direction of the valley Alara had spoken of. He said nothing to her when he returned to the cabin, but she noticed the change in him immediately. The quiet watchfulness was gone, replaced by a tense, coiled stillness. He cleaned his rifle again, this time with a grim purpose. He checked the ammunition, his movements economical and precise. He walked the perimeter of his land not as a proprietor, but as a soldier inspecting his defenses. Fear, cold and familiar, began to seep back into Alara's bones. She knew, without him having to say a word, that the world they had hidden from was coming to find them. The peace they had so carefully constructed was a fragile thing, a pane of ice about to be shattered. 2 days later they appeared. 3 riders, dark figures moving slowly against the vast, snow-patched landscape. They were still miles away, but their intent was clear. They were not passing through. They were heading directly for the cabin. Silas watched them from the window, his face a mask of stone. "Go to the root cellar," he said, his voice low and even. "Bar it from the inside. Don't come out." Not for anything Alara looked from his face to the approaching riders, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The terror was back, a suffocating blanket. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear. But then she looked at Silas. He was not afraid. He was preparing for a fight he had not chosen, for her. He was standing between her and the horror that had followed her. A new feeling, fierce and unfamiliar, rose up to meet the fear, defiance. She would not be that broken thing in the tree ever again. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I will not hide." Silas turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face. He saw the terror there, but he also saw a spine of steel she had forged in the fire of her own survival. He saw a woman who refused to be defined by her victimhood. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Stay away from the window," he ordered. He took his rifle, a spare axe, and moved to the door, a lone guardian against the encroaching darkness. Alara retreated to the back of the cabin, her hands gripping a heavy iron skillet, the only weapon she could find. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a choice. The riders were getting closer. The sound of their horses' hooves on the thawing ground was like the beating of a drum, counting down the final moments of their fragile peace. The 3 men reined in their horses 100 yards from the cabin, their arrogance a palpable force even at a distance. The man in the center, large and bearded, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and then left out in the rain, was clearly the leader. Jedediah. Alara recognized him instantly, and the skillet in her hands felt impossibly heavy, her breath catching in her throat. Silas stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely at his side, not aimed, but ready. He stood there, a silent and immovable obstacle. "This is private property," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "State your business and be on your way." Jedediah spat on the ground, a contemptuous gesture. "We're not here for you, old man. We're looking for something that belongs to us." Tainted woman. Word as she ran this way. His eyes scanned the cabin, cruel and possessive. "We've come to collect her and finish the Lord's work." "There's no one here but me," Silas said, his voice flat and cold. And the only Lord's work I see needing done is you and your men learning some manners. Turn around. One of Jedediah's men laughed. A harsh, ugly sound. He's got spirit, boss. He unlashed the rope from his saddle. Maybe we ought to teach him a lesson first, Jedediah smiled. A predator's grin. Maybe we should. He dismounted, his men following suit. They began to advance on the cabin, fanning out, their intentions clear. Inside, Elara watched through a crack in the wall, her body trembling. She saw the confident swagger in their walk, the same self-righteous certainty they'd had when they dragged her from her home. But then her gaze fell on Silas. He hadn't moved. He stood like a rock, a part of the mountain itself, weathering the approach of a foul storm. He was one man against three, and he was not backing down. As they closed the distance, Silas raised the rifle to his shoulder. "That's far enough," he said, his voice ringing with an authority that gave them pause. "Take one more step, and I'll send you to meet your Lord in pieces." For a heart-stopping moment, no one moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then Jedediah lunged, not at Silas, but to the side, using a water barrel for cover. The other two men drew their pistols. The air exploded with the deafening crack of gunfire. But Silas was faster. His first shot was not aimed at a man, but at the ground just in front of the man on the right, kicking up a spray of mud and rock that made the man flinch and his shot go wild. The second man fired, the bullet splintering the doorframe just inches from Silas's head. Silas didn't even blink. He fired again, his shot tearing through the leg of the first man, who screamed and crumpled to the ground. Jedediah rose from behind the barrel, leveling his own pistol. But as he did, the cabin door flew open. Elara stood there, framed in the doorway, the iron skillet held high. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, but she was standing. She was not hiding. She was facing him. The sight of her, alive and defiant, momentarily stunned Jedediah. It was the only opening Silas needed. He dropped the rifle and charged forward, closing the distance in 3 powerful strides. He crashed into Jedediah with the force of a bull, sending the bigger man sprawling into the mud. The fight devolved into a brutal, close-quarters struggle, fists and grunts, and the sickening thud of bone on bone. The remaining gunman, seeing his leader down, turned his pistol toward Elara. But from the ground, his wounded companion cried out, a distraction that made him hesitate. In that instant, Elara screamed, a raw, piercing sound of fury and pain that seemed to rip from the deepest part of her soul. It wasn't a scream of fear, but of rage. It was the voice she hadn't had when they'd strung her up. The sound unnerved the gunman, and as he turned back toward the main fight, Silas had gained the upper hand, his axe now in his grasp. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. Silence descended, broken only by the groans of the wounded man and the heavy, ragged breathing of Silas. Jedediah lay unconscious in the mud. The third man, seeing the cold, deadly fury in Silas's eyes, dropped his gun and raised his hands in surrender. It was over. The threat was gone. Elara stood on the porch, the heavy skillet still clutched in her hands, her body shaking from the adrenaline. Silas walked over to the wounded man, retrieved his pistol, and then did the same with the others. He looked at Jedediah's man. "Take him," he said, nodding toward Jedediah. "Get on your horses and ride. If I ever see your faces on my land again, I will bury you on it." The man, terrified, needed no further encouragement. He and his wounded companion managed to haul Jedediah's unconscious form onto a horse and, without a backward glance, fled. Silas stood in the muddy yard, watching them go until they were just specks on the horizon. He was covered in mud and blood, a cut bleeding freely on his temple. When they were gone, he finally turned and looked at Elara. She was still standing in the doorway, looking at the spot where her tormentors had been. The skillet had fallen from her hands. He walked slowly toward her, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. He didn't speak, didn't try to comfort her. He simply stood there, waiting. She looked down at him, her eyes tracing the lines of exhaustion and pain on his face. He had fought for her. He had bled for her. He had taken her brokenness into his home and defended it as if it were his own. Tears began to stream down her face, silent tears of grief, of release, of a gratitude so profound it had no words. He had given her more than just shelter. He had given her back a piece of her own strength by showing her what it meant to stand and fight. He reached out, not to touch her, but just held his hand open, palm up. After a moment, she walked down the steps and placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, steady. Together, they turned and walked back into the quiet of the cabin, leaving the violence and the ugliness of the world outside in the mud. The seasons turned. The last of the snow melted, feeding the thirsty earth, and the high plains bloomed with a shy, tenacious life. The cabin, once a sterile refuge, became a home. There was a small garden now, its neat rows a testament to Alara's patient hands. The sound of Silas's axe was often accompanied by the quiet hum of her voice as she worked. The scars on her chest remained, a permanent record of her history, but they no longer defined her. They were a part of her story, but not its ending. Her eyes, once haunted, now held the calm, clear light of the vast sky above them. She had learned to laugh again, a quiet, infrequent sound that Silas cherished more than the rarest birdsong. He too had been transformed. The harsh lines on his face had softened. The solitude he had sought had been a hollow thing, an absence. What he had found with her was a true peace, a quiet companionship that asked for nothing and gave everything. His life was no longer an epilogue, but a new chapter. One evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. It was the same view Silas had looked upon when he had first arrived, but it was no longer desolate. It was beautiful. He was carving a piece of wood, his hands moving with familiar grace. Alara was mending a tear in her dress, her stitches small and even. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared language deeper than words. "I never asked," she said softly, not looking up from her work. "Why you came here? Why you wanted to be so alone?" Silas stopped carving. He looked out at the horizon for a long time. "I was a lawman for a while," he said, his voice low, "in a town full of men like Jedediah. I saw too much of what people are willing to do to each other for greed, or piety, or just for the pleasure of being cruel." He set his carving down. "I thought if I came away, got far enough from all that, I could forget. Thought I could live out my days without having to see it anymore." He looked over at her, his gaze direct and filled with a quiet reverence. "But I was wrong. You don't find humanity by running away from people. You find it by holding on to the ones worth fighting for." He picked up the small block of wood again. It was the figure of a bird, its wings outstretched as if about to take flight. He held it out to her. She put down her sewing and took it, her fingers tracing the smooth, elegant lines. It was a thing of hope, of resilience, a symbol of a spirit that could be brutalized but never caged. She closed her hand around it, a silent thank you passing between them. The world was still a harsh and unforgiving place, but here, in this small pocket of wilderness, two broken souls had found a home. They had taken the ruins of their lives and, side by side, had begun to build something new.